Hello. Hey, Ashen.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Hey, everyone.
I think the recording should be on, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Can everybody hear or read or see us?
Yeah.
So maybe, yeah, so I think Alexander asked to set up this meeting. So I think this was long overdue. So thanks for reminding us. So yeah, so the goal of this call is it's more of a, I think, a development call or the direction of what we are doing and to share the thoughts and the ideas, right? So basically, I don't know whether people have certain topics. I have a few topics that I wanted to discuss, as usual, but maybe we should list them and then we go through them in whatever order we have, right? So the things that I had on the list is one is deviations, which we are actually working on. The second thing is probably, Marcus, the tool, so the config diff tool, right? We should discuss.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Then I have a topic on transactions. And then I think, Alexander, I wanted to understand the topic with the actions a little bit better. I haven't looked into it.
What we haven't discussed last week is also the log implementation, the log change that Alex proposed. So
Yep.
that will also be a topic.
And then I don't know what other things we have on the list. Is there anything from other people? Fabian, we cannot hear you.
Yeah, we're in the same room.
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm in the same room, and I was asking Alex to unmute because if he has the sound on and I have the microphone echo. I was just wondering about the metrics. So there's already quite some topics, but
yeah, metrics. Yeah,
about metrics, since I started adding some metrics for our netconf use case. Now we discussed that a bit. What's the idea there is, or if I understood it correctly, that there's just GNMI metrics at the moment. But I think the other topics are more important first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. I think they're all relevant. I think. So maybe we should first go a little bit on deviation, which is active in the branch, right? So to explain, maybe I don't know whether everybody understood what we are doing exactly. So let me explain. So the thing that we did right now is for us when we get a change. So what happens basically is that the data server has a view, right? And I think at the moment it's by default, it's 30 seconds. I think, Marcus, we are checking whether the intent cache that we hold in the data server, so we basically run through it. We run through the running config to the cache, and then we actually see which intents are in violations or not, and that we report to the config server, right? What the config server did so far was we updated the status of the config. So in the status of the config, there was a field which had all the deviations. And we actually we updated that list in the config. And what typically happened, and there is a second deviation, which was what we called unmanaged config. So everything which did not have an intent went through this unmanaged config deviation. And as a result, so that was what we reported, right? Now, it turns out that, then what happened is because we updated the status, you trigger a reconciliation loop, and that reconcile loop will basically update the config again, and as a result, we are in this revertive mode, right? So basically, you immediately react and you go back to the state that you intended with the desired state that you configured in the config, right? Now, it turns out that there are some people who don't like the fact that you immediately react. They like that you report, but they don't want to react immediately. So we have this requirement on a case which we call non-revertive deviations, right? And so what that is actually you report, but you don't act. Now, then we were looking at how to do so, right? So it turns out that our view is that, that's what we are implementing, is that it's better to move the deviation out of the config status, because the thing that you have in Kubernetes is basically it automatically reconciles immediately. And secondly, the unmanaged config is was a deviation, right? So in other words, what we did is we actually created a new resource, which is a deviation resource. And so what we do right now is, instead of writing to the status, we write to that new deviation resource. And that deviation resource has a link towards the config, right? So every config has a deviation resource that is automatically created. And so what happens right now, and then of course the target, so when you do discovery, that also gets a deviation. So in other words, everything today is based on a deviation. Actually, I can show you, I think. Let me see, it's probably easier to show on a live system. I think it's still running. 1 second, I'll share my screen in a bit. Yeah, 1 second. Where is my screen? Share screen. Entire screen. Do you see this screen? Wait. You see my
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you see what we did is, so you see right now, so I have 3 configs, right? One is a single one and the other one is a set. Wait, it's like this, yeah. So you see that everything by default will get a deviation, and we have 2 types. One is what we call the target, which used to be the unmanaged configs. And then the config type is basically the one that has a one-to-one relationship with the configs. And so what happens right now, yeah, so first of all, I think you have a way better overview of all these deviations. So they all get in one place. And so what happens right now is when a deviation can either be revertive or non-revertive. And the way that you control that is by, you have 2 options. You have a global flag under the SDC / manifest.
So basically set a default for the whole server,
Yeah.
or you change it per
Oops.
per config, right? Config or config set.
Correct. Yeah. So there is a revertive flag here, right?
Yeah, it's the deployment, right? Part of the deployment environment variable that sets the whole thing globally.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can switch it on or off, like set the global default here.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. and then there's
the other
like
option,
under the config or config set.
yes, under the config set or config, yeah, you have also a flag that you can enable it per config. Yeah.
Or
So-
disable, right?
Yeah, you can.
Depending on the default, you can like toggle it in the config, or
Correct. Yeah.
like flip it. Whatever.
Yeah, so the idea is that you can basically, you have a global flag and then you have a per config flag. And so if you don't have a local flag, the global flag will, let's say, will be used, right? And if it's the global flag is not set, it's the default is revertive. Right. So yeah. Now given that this is a design call, is that we wanted at the moment, so we are testing it. There is still a problem somewhere which we are investigating. But there is one more thing that we discovered during this exercise, is that what we do that actually we want to do another change which is related to transactions, right? So today, what we do is we take each of these individual config snippets, right? And so you have a reconcile loop for every config snippet, right? Now, when you have a very large configuration, it means that it could be that some leaf wraps are not resolved, so you get so it fails and then it re-triggers the reconciliation loop and stuff like that. So it could be that it takes a bit of time before it actually resolves, right? So we also felt during this work is that it is better that we change that implementation and take instead of having a control loop per config snippet, it is better to have a control loop for a whole, let's say, device or a target, if you will, that we are managing. And so the behavior would be is that, so that is not implemented yet, first of all. But I wanted to get your feedback. So the difference is that right now we do it one by one, and then if there is leaf wraps that are not resolved, so it will trigger a reconciliation loop and stuff like that. So it could have some cascading effects. Whereas in that mode, what you would do is that we would take all the config snippets that are in the data store, not in the data store, in the API server store, and we would take them all together, including if you are in non-revertive mode for deviation, a deviation is also seen as a config snippet. And that's how we do non-revertiveness. So yeah, maybe I should have explained that before. So the way that we do non-revertiveness is we apply both the intent, like the config snippet, plus the deviation that was seen to the system, and as such that normally results in the same status, right? So is that clear? So in other words, we transact both to the data server, we transact both the config snippet as well as the deviation snippet. And it's the combination of the two that if you are in deviation and you have and you apply them both again, that should result in the same status, and that's how we do non-revertiveness. In revertiveness, what we do is we do not apply the deviation, so that's void. So we only take the config snippet and that we apply. If that makes sense. If you have questions, please interrupt me.
Question. So let's say we have multiple config snippets. Like say, for example, there are multiple DNNs we want to configure on a node. Yeah. Which results in multiple config snippets.
Yeah.
So does it mean like each of the config snippet, or like I guess like the subset of configs, it doesn't include any reconciliation? Like for each config snippet, it doesn't have a reconciliation group, right? So in the end, it's a monolith config. Is that like how it's handled? Like in the end, like do you combine them at the?
Yeah, so what happens is, so it's a bit tricky. So in other words, the resource in Kubernetes API is still a config resource, right? As you have the snippet. What happens is instead of doing the reconcile loop on a per config snippet basis, what would happen is that a change of one of them that is relevant to a given target creates a reconciliation loop. So it's still let's say, triggered on a per individual basis, but the way that those work queues, so the work queue that we would use or that we would assign is one on a per target basis, which means that, for example, if you have 10 configuration snippets and they all change at the same time, Normally in the queue, there is some coalescing involved, so you don't really do 10 reconciliation loops. What you do is you get 1 or maybe 2, right? But what the controller does, instead of taking the one config snippet, it takes all of them that are relevant to a target, and he is combining them together, but still as individual items. So we continue to have snippets as the operating model, because that allows us to do the ownership model. So we can relate every config line to the ownership of the intent or the config snippet. So that's we continuously retain. But the result is that the way that we transact towards the device is we combine all the ones that got changed. So for example,
okay. Yeah.
if you have 10 and only 1 changed, we will only transact 1. You see? But
Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
we take them together. You see what so we take them together, and that normally would result in faster and in more deterministic behavior with respect to the reconcile loop. Because the way that Yang, so the challenge that you have right now by managing them as individual snippets, the result is that some leaf ref deviation or maybe other must statements and what have you could be failing. Whereas in this case, because we take all the config together, so normally all that config should normally result in a valid configuration. So the chances of succeeding with a transaction is much higher. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks.
But yeah, so the way that you have to think about what is the difference between revertive and non-revertive behavior, it's not very... the only difference between the two, in essence, is that in the case of non-revertive, we also use the deviation as a config snippet, and we treat them as a higher priority than the config snippet. Yeah, and that's another important thing that I need to mention, is that as a result of that, and I need to look at the code, what we did, is that we make priorities a mandatory parameter. And I don't know whether that's a problem. And we also wanted to introduce a minimum value for a priority. And the reason why we do that is that in non-revertive mode, we subtract -1 from the priority of the deviation because we wanted to treat it as a higher priority. As such, we can guarantee that the deviation always wins in non-revertive mode. But if you start your config without the priority, which means it has 0, then the consequence is that you will get -1, minus what have you, right? So I think we are preventing that anyhow, but so it would be 0 as well. So they would be treated as the same priority. And that could result in revertiveness. So we also wanted to introduce so the priority became mandatory, and there is a minimum value. And I think I still have to document it. It is set at, let me check. How did I do it? That's not in this branch. 2. So it has to be higher than 2. Is that okay?
One thing that I'm concerned about with the reconciliation per target is that if we combine all the intents, we might run into a situation where just a single intent does not work, right? Like provides an error when applied, and then
all the rest.
I mean, in the actual case, we would just not commit that single intent, but like all the others would get applied, right? And the whole system would still be able to evolve.
Mhm.
But in that case, what do we do?
Well,
I mean,
it will
do we have
also-
a strategy to
No.
prevent blocking the
So
whole
what-
thing?
So what you can do is, so you normally, so the report, so we give you feedback still on a per intent basis of what worked or what didn't work, right? So you actually see which one failed and which one did not fail, right? And so what you can introduce is an ability to disable a config snippet or something like that. So you could say admin down or something like that. And then it would not be transacting, if that makes sense.
So essentially, we're moving to batching these configs from doing one at a time to just having multiple submitted at the same time.
This is not implemented. This is a discussion, right? So whether we should do that or not. So at the moment, it's still individual. So at the moment, the way it works is we haven't done any change with respect to that. We only implemented the revertive behavior, and the revertive behavior behaves on a per. So the implementation is still on a per config snippet basis at the moment. So the change to do it all, to patch them all together or take them all together, is not implemented yet. That was more of a question whether we should do that or not.
We've noticed that we started investigating but haven't continued too far. Is that there was a case where if we had multiple configs pointing to the same device, maybe with the same priority, the configs would switch between ready, true and false continuously. And we'd have one that was ready, the rest be false, and then it would switch to one of the other ones being ready and the rest being not ready. And I think submitting them all together would likely stop this, but it could be a different underlying issue. And the reason why we haven't yet fully investigated why this is happening. Someone on our team is now looking into it. But it was, essentially this ready state kept flipping between ready true, ready false.
The question is, I feel that normally when you submit your config towards the API server, they should work normally, right? Or that's my assumption at the moment, is that you shouldn't, or people should, or don't submit just thing that they might think so, because normally I'm of the opinion that someone should test that stuff before you actually apply to the Kubernetes API server somehow. So as such, grouping them is a better approach if you take that assumption, right? But Marcus is right, is that if you have certain config snippets that wouldn't work, that means that if you do the batching approach, then it might be so that nothing works versus before you had like 9 out of 10 worked and 1 failed. So in this case, all 10 fail.
But we do have a link between the source of a specific value, right? In this leaf variance, we know which intents caused this value to be present somehow.
Yes, we still report, right? So it's still reported on a per intent basis. So that's my view. That's how it should work. So you should know which one caused the failure.
Yeah, but then in the config server, it would be possible to apply just a failed state to that specific intent, right? If we know this way, the rest of them won't be failed, but just that one would. Of course, this is a case where the system is not as you would expect it, right?
Yeah. Now, correct. So we haven't implemented, but indeed, I mean, one way to go around the 9 to 10 is that in case you have 10 and 1 fails with a leaf ref, for example, that is invalid, then what would happen is so you first transact all 10, it fails. Normally the one that fails, and normally because it's leaf ref validation, it's non-revertive, so there is an error type. Depending on the type of error, we know whether this is recoverable or not. And so normally when we apply the status, we indicate whether or not that is recoverable. And so the way the current implementation is that if it's a recoverable error, it will retry. So normally what should happen is that in the case of 10, one fails, the one will be indicated as bad and non-revertive. So that will trigger a new reconciliation loop, in which case the one that is non-recoverable will not be retried. So the other 9 will be retried.
But that means that the state that's on the device is not going to match what's in the Cube API.
Yeah, I mean,
what do you expect in that case, right? If you throw in an intent that's like plain wrong or cannot be implemented, then you try to bring it as close as possible to the intended state. Huh?
Yeah, so I mean, the status is reflected in line, because what will happen, Alexander, is that 9 will be in ready and the 1 will be in not ready with a failure. Right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So now what we also do, by the way, at the moment is that, because what could happen as well, and that we already do today, is like you have a config and you change, right? So we keep track of the one that succeeded. And so what is also important here is that everything that succeeded remains succeeded, right? So in other words, we keep track of the state. So in other words, if you would change something that worked and it didn't work, the new thing didn't work, we still apply the old stuff. But I feel, my view is that this transaction, grouping them together, is going to end up in a more deterministic system. But yeah, so yeah, that's my personal view.
Yeah.
Because somehow these config snippets, they can be related, right? Depending on, of course, how you slice and dice them. And for example, if your DNNs have a reference to a DNS entry that is central, you'll have a central reference, right? So if there is somewhere a config snippet that has that, they all need to be dependent. They are all depending on it, right?
Yeah, that would have been my next question about dependencies. If this would be just sort of assumed by priorities, or if there's going to have to be a waiting until specific snippets are ready to be applied.
No, so the idea is we just take whatever the API server is. So the reconcile loop would still be, so the way it would work, I mean, maybe I should draw it on the screen, right? Let me draw it. The way it works, let me draw it on the screen, right? Then it's probably 5 times easier to comprehend. Yeah, so I don't have a good, so this is a queue, right? Oops. That. Let's say this is a queue with a set of entries, right? Yeah, I don't have a, okay, I'll do it quick. It's not going to be a nice drawing. You see my screen, by the way, right?
Yep.
So what's going to happen is the following. So let's say we have, these are config snippets, right? Config 1, and they all apply to the same target, right? And so on, right? So what's going to happen? So the reconciler that is here, right, is watching the config resource, right? So this guy, so this is the reconciler. and it acts on a per target basis, right? So what it does, it watches the config resource, and it basically looks at the labels, and it looks at the target, right? So what it looks at for the device, it looks at the target's name and namespace, right? And so what will happen is a change of any config that is related to the target and the namespace will create an entry in this queue, right? And so what the reconciler, so this will trigger an event, right, towards the reconciler. And yeah, so I will draw it like that, right? So any entry here will end up with a reconcile loop. What the reconcile loop does, it reads all the configs and all the deviations in case of non-revertiveness, right? So all the deviations of a given device, right? Because they have a one-to-one relationship except for the target, right? So what will happen is, yeah, and I probably need to say here. Right? So what will happen is that when this guy gets triggered, it reads all of this from the API, from the cache actually, right? It then checks, did they change? Or was there a non-ready condition? For example, if this guy failed, if this one failed, it would not retry this one, right? So, and it checks, is the config snippet, was it applied already and did it change? If not, it will not be included. If it changed, so for example, if this is green, it's not changed. If it is changed, let's say it's orange, it will take this and add it to the list, but green will stay green, right? As long as the configuration is the same, it will stay.
But then the data server is keeping track of the intents.
Correct.
To do this priority-based.
Yes, merging and stuff like that. So we don't care. So the reconciliation, we don't care at this level on the priorities and stuff like that. That still happens. So the data server is still, there's no change on the data server. The only difference that what we'll see is that the data server will get them all together, whereas before they got them as individual elements.
What if config 2 and config n did change at the same time? Config 2 ends up in how did you call it?
Wait, so what happens is that if it is non-revertive, so if an error that is non-revertive will only be retried if the config changed. So for example, if you change the config of 2, the retry will happen. So
no, I'm trying to figure out, like, based on the transactions that we have, where we already group these configurations, and let's say in the working queue it ends up a change to config 2 and config n, and only 2 basically fails. The transaction will be rolled back, right? Because the whole transaction cannot be applied, right? So, like, what does happen to the status of config n? Because in my view, you would need to set up a new transaction without config 2 to even figure out if config n would make it to the device. So yeah, like, a set transaction reflects the errors per intent. So the error wouldn't be reflected on n. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So if we transact, right? So in other words, this will result in a transaction, right, to data server. If data server tells config 2 failed, right, with an error that is non-recoverable, we will add that to the status. If config n is not in error, it will, so what will happen is that we update the status of the config, so it will trigger a new entry in this queue. The reconciler loop will re-trigger. It now takes, it looks a bit back to all the ones. It sees that this one was failed and is non-revertive and the config didn't change, so this one will not be taken. It will take config N and it does a new transaction, and normally that should succeed.
Yeah, only
Right.
in the case that it's non-revertive. Or does it?
So the retries has nothing to do with revertiveness or non-revertiveness. What revertiveness does
You
is...
said revertive, that's why he's
sorry, okay,
confused. So you're like, you
sorry,
said a couple of times you
I was-
mixed it now, so we have
Okay,
to be a bit careful here, I guess.
Yeah, so sorry, that was my bad. So yeah, one is non-recoverable, I should have said, and the other one is deviation, is non-revertive and deviation. So it's non-recoverable, I should have said.
Okay. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So this would result in as many reconciliation tries as failed.
Wait, so if it fails, so let's say both you transacted to an N, right? And they both have an error that is non-recoverable, then there will not be retried.
But it would be in order. So let's say we have these 1, 2, 3, 4 config entries, right? And config 2 fails.
Yes.
The first reconcile loop would have tried and apply 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
Data server would report 2 failed.
Yeah.
Then the target reconciler would then try again and send 1, 3, and 4.
Correct. Yeah.
And this would loop until we successfully apply or all of them have failed, essentially.
Yeah, so yeah, correct. So if when do we not retry is that we don't retry if they are ready and nothing changed, right? So there is some change control that is happening in the config server. One is, did the config change? One is it recoverable or non-recoverable error? Is the content of the config, did it change or not? I think that's it, yeah.
Okay. And in the case of the transactions, we'd essentially keep reverting the transactions until we have a successful set that was applied. Okay, set maybe is the wrong word, but group of configs that were applied.
Yeah, what we don't retry, if the config didn't change and they are non-recoverable, right? Then I want to have a human in the loop, because otherwise we continue retrying, right?
Yeah, sure.
So there, but you will see it. So normally you will see in the config snippet that it's not ready and there is an error. Because the problem is that if it's really non-recoverable, then yeah, the idea is not to continue to retry, right?
Yes, no, that's true. Would it make sense for the data server to anyway try and apply all of the configs before returning errors, so that we can have, after this, instead of having n reconcile loops, we just have one extra?
Yeah, it is. It will be like that, right? So, but I don't think the data server should do it by himself, because otherwise you have two control loops that go together, right? But so the data server will, so for example, take the back example, let's say this is 1, 2, and 3, right? To make it simple, right?
They'll all be bundled in a single transaction, Alex.
Yeah, sure. What I mean is, theoretically, this could result in n transactions being applied to the device, right?
No.
No.
No, because what happens, they're all added to a single transaction, and we report errors based on transactions, based on configs, on intents, right? So if 2 of those do fail, then we report these 2, and as Wim said, like in the next loop, if they're reported as non-recoverable, they'll be skipped from the next set transaction call. So yeah, it would not be n
Okay.
transactions.
My understanding would be that we would fail as soon as we reached an issue, right? And this would then theoretically result in that being removed from the next transaction attempt, but other ones which might also be failing would not.
No, I mean there
That's-
are obviously multiple things that can go wrong, right? But let's consider let's consider that this config will end up as not valid, right? Then we usually have the dependency between, okay, this intent try to set this value, but this value is not valid, so we flag that as an error for this intent snippet.
Yeah, no, my yes, understood. But the data server still has the knowledge of the other possible values for that config path, right? Or that config node.
You mean if it's shadowed?
Yes, for example, it could then fall back to the next high priority one and then do this apply with then returning that the highest priority one or whichever this snippet had an issue, but then the transaction would still the transaction would not succeed overall, but you would have the state as close as possible to what was desired done in one step. But then you kind of lose this transaction rollback, because at what point then do you roll back when all the config snippets for a specific value don't work, I assume. But that's then the question.
But
right?
I think one important thing, Alex, is that the transaction, if it fails for one, right, they're all rolled back. So in other words, in case, take this example, 1, 2, and 3, and 2 was bad, right? We send it to the data server altogether. Although only 2 failed, none of them will be retained at the data server, right? So, but what will happen on the config server, it will see that 2 was non-recoverable. It will retry with 1 and 3. If that succeeds, then data server will keep 1 and 3.
Yeah, sure. But then we go back to the question of, do we want this state to be applied if there are failing configs? Right.
Okay, that's a different question. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, that's a behavior that we can control in config server. That's before was hard to do. With this, you can do, right?
Yeah, sure. But that's then something that I guess.
I mean, there are. I would assume we have at least 2 kinds of configurations, right? So one is base device configuration that makes a device work, and then I would say the second category is service configurations, right? So service configurations, I would for sure say, okay, if someone misconfigures a single service, only that service should be impacted, right? And like not applying that or yeah, just that one is fine. But I can see I can also see cases where the config that is failing is maybe some mandatory firewall or whatever stuff, right? Like generally necessary for the box. And yeah, I mean, maybe it's a good idea to have a flag somewhere that indicates this, that tells like, all right, if this is not gonna get applied, then don't apply anything or so. I don't know, but yeah, I would say for in general for services, if a single service doesn't come up, it shouldn't impact all the others.
Yeah, now we want to make it generic, right? So we want to understand, because for me, a service in config server shouldn't really be something. There should be an indication, and you can use it for services, right? So it should be generic in the sense that, because I think you have all kinds of usage patterns, right? That we want to apply. But I think first we need to do is have the basics to work, right? And then we can potentially introduce more, let's say, grouping or something like that, grouping capabilities, right?
Yeah, I think in general it makes sense for me. This grouping. Yeah, I'm imagining it a bit like instead of currently having just one set intent per reconcile loop for the configs, it just does in that set, just bundles all of them together.
Yeah.
So in the end, it just is moving the work of doing one at a time from the config server to one at a time at the data server level, right? In terms of inserting those data into the config tree and then processing them.
Correct. So I think from an outside, the behavior is not very different. It's just how it's being applied is a bit different. But from the outside, you will see the system as almost the same.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. The deviation. So the deviation has an impact on the API. So that's why we wanted to introduce this ASEP, right? The challenge is that Hans is on holiday for 2 weeks, so our QA person is a bit gone. But I was also getting a feeling whether we should do this grouping or not. I'm of the opinion that this should help overall.
I think that it could also help with cases where multiple transactions to the device would keep overwriting the same value.
Yeah. So yeah, correct.
Yeah, if you're processing one after another, and the later configs have a higher priority for the same config path, then you would just keep transacting to the device a different value consistently, and this might not be very useful. So having them all bundled together means you can at one time figure out the resolve value, as you have a sort of overview of the whole system, or of the whole config, intended config.
Yeah. Yeah, today what we do when you have the same priority, normally the time should, I think the first one that applies is the winner, I think. But that was the idea.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I sense that we should at least try to see what this gives, right? And because I have the feeling it becomes it's more scalable at the end of the day if we do this. And by the way, we do something like this when on startup, right? So when data, let's say when you restart SDC, what we do basically is I actually do this process more or less. So I look at all the configs that were applied, and I take those, and if those succeed, that brings the target back to a ready state. So if that doesn't succeed, I will never bring the target in ready status, because it means that you cannot get your status back into a mode that you had before. If you see what I'm saying. So right now, when let's say you have an existing environment that is running, and let's say you restart SDC, the idea is that you should come back to the same status as you were in before to make it recoverable. So what I do to accomplish that is I do actually this behavior. So as part of the target readiness state, there is one gate that actually does take all the configs that were applied and were successful. It groups them together and transacts them. And if that,
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, if that does not succeed, your target will never become ready.
This is the config not ready
Yes.
condition. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. But the reason why we started thinking about this again was because with deviations, we have to also apply the deviations, and the data server needs to see them all in order to be able to do non-revertive behavior. So as a result, it should not only see the deviation of config 1, but it should see the configurations of all the ones that were successful. And that's the only way you can get non-revertive behavior. So as such, that was for me a trigger to come back to the idea of doing it this way. And then we're also looking at network-wide transactions, which would actually also benefit from this. So I have the feeling, yeah, I have a perception, or if you look to the consequences, I have the feeling they are more positive than negative. So, but yeah, so what I will do is I will try to implement this and then see where we get, and then try to do some experiment with it and get some feeling. Okay, so we took a lot of time. Yeah. Few minutes left, so I don't know which one are the urgent topics you guys wanted to discuss. We still have config, diff, actions, log, and metrics. Fabian, do you want to quickly go to metrics, or?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the question was just for the metrics, what the idea there is, if I understood it correctly. At the moment, there's just metrics for GNMI. So you look at the messages you receive from data server from GNMI and output there, and now I added just basic metrics for netconf devices. So for example, to see if the target is ready, what is the version of the schema, and just some information. I want to know if there's already an idea there of what you would like to do, or so now
we have
by config server.
Yeah, so there is two types of metrics that we wanted to expose. One is what I call internal metrics of the config server system, including the data server. So at the moment, so that is, we expose two metric endpoints right now. One is a metric endpoint to expose what I call the internal metrics of the config/data server and stuff like that, although it's at the moment only config server. So the idea was to give status information on how good the system is running, or how in what state the SDC as a system is, right? At the moment, I think we only expose the Go metrics, but we can expand it to other metrics to it. And so I expose it through the control manager Prometheus endpoint. Prometheus endpoint that use it. There is a second use of the metric, which is basically exposing metrics from the devices that we are managing, right? And that's where I was adding, or I've added GNMI for the time being. So what that does, there is a subscription snippet. I think if you go to docs.sdcio, or is it docs? Yes.
It should be. I have the docs.
SDC. Again? Docs, yeah, with the S, yeah, sorry.
SDC.
Yes, yeah, no.
Yeah. Back to it's a C, not the S.
Sorry. Yes. So here there is user guide. There is also a subscription CRD. What this allows you to do is you can get metrics from the system, from the device, from the target. Right. So this is a Prometheus endpoint that is exposed, and so at the moment it's GNMI. So here you can on the device subscribe to certain parts of that the device supports, and then this is exposed through a Prometheus endpoint as well. So there is two sets of metrics in the system.
Yeah, I see they're quite different, because for us it was more thinking about, at the moment the CNFs, we have a dashboard in Grafana where we see all the versions, and the idea would to be able to have something similar. So using the tags of the Prometheus metrics, you can then say which versions of what configs are deployed. If we're versioning then of the configs, and that you can then create a dashboard which says Grafana which version schema of the configs is deployed, which schemas, and are they in sync or not, or is there an issue? So the idea, and I don't know if then this metric, if this endpoint should be the same than the one you just showed here, or
yeah. So if it's really device that has not really anything to do with the config server's health, it should be exposed through something like this, right? Where you basically subscribe to the device with certain parts, right? And you expose the data.
What about things like deviations and failed applies and so on? Where would this fit in?
So that you get normally outside of the Kubernetes, you get straight from Kubernetes cluster, right?
Yeah, like the deviation counts and so on. This is now what you showed, I think, a bit with this new deviation resource. You have the counts of deviations,
Yeah.
but there's also deviation reasons, right? Because you have some cases where you have a deviation because it's just not, you filter out that specific config path, for example, from the netconf get. In our case, we're using netconf, not GNMI, so that's netconf.
So those I see you can get straight from the API server of Kubernetes, right?
Yeah.
Yes. You can also get those, I guess, into Grafana. So
correct, yeah, indeed. So there is some projects that use that data and expose it as data. So yeah, one of the things that I did in the past was I created a watcher on this resource and then exposed some of the data in Prometheus endpoint.
So this is a separate.
Yeah, this would be completely separate from this. Yeah, but you could actually make this as part of the project as well, right? So you could.
Yeah. Is that something that would
question
as a sort of third endpoint, or is this something that you think should be independent and sort of user defined?
I mean, the question is, should it be part of the first endpoint or the second endpoint, or is it the third endpoint? I haven't really thought it through. You could, so I always like to build things that are reusable and do one thing well, right? You could argue, is it part of, I think it's not part of the device statistics, right? So that it doesn't fit in the one you see here. The question is, does it fit into, so this is monitoring. So that's the second part. This is the first one that I was explaining. So here you get
view usage, number of reconcile loops, and so on, right? This is
yeah, it's internal stuff. So here you could argue that some of that deviation data and stuff like that would fit here, right? Or not? I mean,
some yes, some no, depends.
correct.
If it's deviations, then maybe. But if it's specifics about why deviations are happening,
probably not. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, maybe you can start building your own controller or something like that that just takes the data, does a watch, and updates the Prometheus data. It's actually very simple to build, right?
Yeah, I agree. That probably doesn't make sense to duplicate the things that's available in Cube.
And then you could install it as a separate operator into the project, and they are related, but they are not related somehow, right? So this could be a third exposure of which we get the data. But I think, yeah, so I think maybe we should treat them as a separate thing, right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ashan, I interrupted you, I think.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I have a question. So we are looking into it's a bit on a higher level, like on the service configuration, like for DNN in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So a DNN have multiple configs, right? For one would be for the user plane, the other one would be for the subscribers, etc.
Yeah.
If we can map the relationship, can we also get a visibility on the service level config? Like, let's say, for example, there's like a dependency between the UPF and the substrate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, ADU, DSF, and stuff like that. So they everywhere, basically, right?
But I don't think that's a Prometheus kind of like a metric, but some sort of like a topology weave. Is that something that you envision happening on SDC or on a different level? Like,
I see this happening more at Choreo level. So in Choreo, you get this out of the box.
right.
Because the way I see
yeah.
it is that you have services, right? So you have services, and this is really device stuff, right? That is derived from the service somehow, right? So let's say you have a DNN, which has implications on, what is it, AUDSF, SMF, and UPF.
Correct. Like let's say there's a relationship with two different nodes, and then
Yes.
it has a config snippet per device.
Correct. So there is a config of each device, right? So you have a config for UPF and let's say a config for SMF, right? To make it simple.
Yeah.
And so what you will then do is you actually need to say, okay, the DNN itself, if it works on UPF but not on SMF, you actually need to say the health of the DNN is not good because there is an SMF that is not really configured. So that would happen at that level, I think.
Okay. It's at a high level then. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But what will happen is that what we do in SDC, right? Let's say you have a DNN configuration. Let's say you have, let's say DNN configuration A and let's say DNN configuration B, if you will, right? What we will be able to do in SDC is we will say that this configuration is coming from DNN service A and this one from service B. That we can say, but we cannot relate it to the SMF.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But we can relate a configuration snippet on the device towards the intent, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. And then you have the relationship mapped at a higher level.
Correct. So the relationship between UPF and SMF we have to have at a higher level because there is no data in the config server. But the relationship of which configuration parameter on the device was a result of the configuration snippet of DNN A and DNN B, that we will be able to say.
Okay.
So if you look to a config of the device, we should be able to say which parameter of the config came from which intent, if you will.
Yep. Okay.
So we introduced some feature called config blame. I don't know whether you saw it. We still have to document it. That basically allows you to do so. So Marcus did that. So in Git, you have a Git blame. So you can basically say which piece of code was owned or was contributed by which person, right? So we have a similar capability in config server where you can say which config snippet was owned or came or who was responsible for that config snippet. So that's what we call the blame, config blame.
Yep. Okay.
But the relationship to other configs on other devices, that we don't retain, right? Because we don't have a view of that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Makes sense. Yeah.
All right. Anything else for now? We run a bit over time.
Yeah, I guess the other topics we can address next.
Yeah, we can, but you are off next week, right? But yeah, we'll have it. So at the moment, it's scheduled to be a weekly call. So we can see based in beginning, I guess we have lots of topics and then
Yeah, I'm likely to be off next week, but I might be able to join, but I will only know on the day. So
yeah, that's okay. Yeah, but the call is on anyhow, so we'll see. Yeah. All right. If you have topics or something like that, I think you can also put them on the Discord channel or something like that, or maybe I'll add a page somewhere that we can just add topics and agenda or something like that. Yeah, I'll add that.
Yeah, that would be nice. Or sort of an overview of these topics we discussed. And
yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate. And then we'll be in touch.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It's-
Thanks. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, likewise.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Cheers.